This beautiful island behind me is a home for many and a holiday destination for many more, but it has a dark past. At one point in its history, Inishbofin was a prison with Cromwellian soldiers as jailers and Catholic priests as prisoners. Sometimes we imagine that the Catholic priesthood was entirely suppressed after the Reformation in Ireland, or that priests here were constantly being hunted. But the truth is that there were times and places in the 16th and 17th centuries when priests were relatively free to move about and minister, when friars and Jesuits were able to live in communities, to set up schools and so on. And their preaching fed into a new Catholic confidence in Ireland, which took the shape of a rebellion in 1641. And a brief period of Irish Catholic self-governance known as the Confederation of Kilkenny, which was eventually crushed by Cromwell's invasion beginning in 1649. This island of Inishbofin was actually the last stronghold of the anti-Cromwellian resistance in Ireland. By 1653, Cromwell and the New Model Army had truly conquered the country, often in brutal fashion. And from this time until the restoration of Charles II in 1660, it was an incredibly dangerous time to be a priest. An order for banishing all priests was published by the government in 1653, declaring that all Catholic clergy were guilty of high treason, and that those who refused to leave Ireland or abandon their Catholic faith would be liable to the punishment of hanging, then being cut down while still alive, beheaded, quartered, disemboweled, and burned. These years are a period when priest hunters were thriving. There was a £5 reward for the capture of a priest, and many soldiers and others were enriched by finding priests active in their ministry. It was also, therefore, a period of priestly disguise and subterfuge. We hear of a Wexford priest disguising himself as a tailor, a gardener, a thatcher, and a milkman before eventually being captured. A priest called James Fallon, who escaped Galway after it fell to Cromwell's forces, lived in hiding in a tiny hut at the base of a mountain in Connemara alone with all his books until he was captured in 1654. Now, many priests were executed when they were caught. One contemporary report estimates that several hundred priests were put to death in this period. But the Cromwellian regime realized quickly that the martyrdom of these priests was stirring up Catholic resistance. The Archbishop of Tuam, in exile in Nantes, wrote that the Puritans were concerned at what he called the incredible joy with which many priests faced death. And so the Puritans decided to opt for perpetual imprisonment instead. An Irish Jesuit reporting at the time writes that prisons everywhere are filled with bishops, priests and religious, some of whom are executed on the scaffold, others privately butchered, he said, and the greater number sent into exile. To take just one example, in Carrickfergus jail in July 1656, there were 26 priests imprisoned. And we're told those priests were awaiting transportation to Barbados. That was the first solution the Cromwellians arrived at for all of these priests in their prisons. From around 1655, the solution was to send them to Barbados as indentured servants, along with the many thousands of Irish men, women and children already consigned to that fate. So that's what was tried, but it didn't work for several reasons. Firstly, because Barbados was too easy for the priests to escape from. One who was transported there, James Chute, ended up ministering back in Ireland, which is the last thing the Cromwellian Commonwealth wanted. But Barbados didn't really want the priests either. The Puritan governor of Barbados was concerned that these educated and rebellious men might provoke a local revolution there. In 1657, a new solution was arrived at, much closer to home. The old Catholic enclave of Inishbofin had just been kitted out with a huge new fort, which you can see behind me, and a garrison of English soldiers. What more secure solution than to turn this fortress island into an island prison? For the next 5 years, that's what this place was, for probably 100 or more priests, including Dominican and Franciscan friars. And it was by no means a pleasant imprisonment. There are many independent reports that the prisoners here were effectively being starved. One report says they survived on a diet of herbs and water. Another said that this was a place of utter misery and hunger. Perhaps even more significant than the physical pain was the spiritual pain involved. These priests were not allowed to celebrate Mass, or even to minister to one another. They couldn't hear each other's confessions, and if one lay dying, they weren't allowed to anoint him and to prepare him for his death. The prisoners of Inishbofin were released from their horrific captivity in 1662, when Charles II was back on the throne and favourable to the Catholic faith, a faith shared by his own mother and wife. We don't know what became of all of these prisoners. Some we know died soon after their release, and others we hear of exercising their priestly ministry several years later. For these men, this island was a place of hunger, but they were hardy men, and they were hopeful men. It was a dark time, but for me, the perseverance of these priests in this place only adds to the beauty of Inishbofin.